What's going on is not just, hey, why don't we all get together and join hands and smash the system? Because people have been trying that forever. But there are certain moments in the history of the world. There are certain moments on the clock of the world where it's possible to change the world. And I've been teaching for 20 odd years, and all my students wanted to change the world. But the time was never right. And now it is.
Welcome to another episode of the Agroecology Radio Hour, your monthly podcast that explores the issues of food sovereignty in the Australian landscape. I'm your host, Lucy Ridge, speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri. Today's guests on the podcast are AFSA's focal point for farmers Tammi Jonas and activist academic Raj Patel. Tammi has been farming on unceded Dja Dja Wurrung country for close to 15 years. Jonai Farms grows uncommonly delicious pork, beef, and they also share the land with Indigenous-led market gardeners, Tampanyeri growers. Although she doesn't generally use the honorific, Tammi is technically Dr. Jonas, and it was through working on her PhD that some of these really meaty conversations began with Raj, and so we're excited to continue those today. Raj Patel is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and academic. His first book was Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and his acclaimed latest book, co-authored with Rupa Maria, is entitled Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. In addition to his scholarly work, he regularly writes columns for outlets such as The Guardian, and he has been a staunch food sovereignty activist through his work with La Via Campesina and pro-democracy organisations around the world. Welcome, Tammi and Raj.
Hey, Liz.
It's lovely to be here.
So we always like to begin by inviting our guests to tell us where they are and really ground us in their place for a moment. So tell us what's happening where you are right now, Raj.
So I'm in Austin, Texas, the state that fought for slavery twice. And I mentioned that just because we're not allowed to say that to kids in junior school here because it might make white people uncomfortable. So it's always important to say it as often as one can. And it's I think that's what's happening here is that we are sort of a test lab for this sort of Trumpist moment of the end of democracy and the beginning of something else. The university that I work at has had its faculty council dissolved and replaced by hand-picked supporters of the regime. And it all looks like an episode of Andor, except the food is slightly better. And that's it. I mean, we're the sort of tech hub of where Elon Musk is down the road and we have robot taxis everywhere. So we're living in the future here, which is fascism and robot taxis.
Wow. And Tammi, where are you at the moment? What's happening around you?
I'm both pleased for myself and sad for Raj to report that it's not so grim where I am specifically here on unceded Wurundjeri country in what's now known as Melbourne. Not, as I said when I joined you all this morning.
No robot taxis?
I'm not on Jara country because I had my deliveries yesterday, and fortuitously there was also an event of some young anarchists coming back to tell about their experience of going to the Zapatista gathering in Mexico, in Chiapas. So that was a pretty inspirational evening with a lot of people from their early 20s to their probably 60s. Listening to what that kind of gathering, the energy it brings to not only the gathering in Chiapas, but that they bring back to their homes to say, how are we going to fight for a better world that they know is possible because the Zapatistas have been doing it. So that's the space in which I come to this.
Excellent. Well, we're coming from quite a diverse range of places today. But I'm excited for the conversation that will follow. And I guess, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is kind of an extension of conversations that Raj and Tammi have been having, over the past couple of years, and particularly at the most recent Naleni process meeting in Sri Lanka. There was one question, Tammi, that you said Raj really asked you to explore and draw out a little bit more in your thesis. And that question was, what is the role of the state in food system? So I wondered if we could start there.
Yes, well, I'll tell you what I said to Raj and what I ended up beefing up in my conclusion so that I could make it clearer what I guess I was trying to explore in the thesis about, and what we've been trying to explore as activists for, decades. And for me, it's that the role of the state to a certain extent is immaterial because it will always be problematic. And so even as we work on giving the state more of a role, taking away more of the state's roles and deciding which aspects of society the state should be very involved in and less involved in, what will remain a constant is it will become problematic at some point, if not repeatedly. And so the role of society is to stay incredibly collectivized, whether through very local collectives and through bigger collectives and through collectives of collectives, to keep dealing with the problem of the state as it arises. So that's what I responded with. And now I want to hear what Raj thinks, because I never got to hear the full answer back.
Oh, I don't have an answer. This is a genuine question, as you know. I mean, this is shot through with ambiguity because every peasant movement has a very ambiguous relationship to the state, where it's clear that you want things and you want the state to stop doing things. And the vision that one has is sometimes articulated with ideas of socialism and communism and Maoism, for example, which is the only sort of real political philosophy that took peasants' intelligence seriously. These forms of organizing have the state as its goal. And at the same time, we all know that the state is going to betray you, even if your comrades get in. We still live under late capitalism, and they will be assailed and bought out and in other ways compromised through the state and through the bourgeois machinery that created the state in the first place. So, I mean, there's no absolute answer here, and it always depends on context, and it depends on the crisis that the state is going through at the moment, and it depends on who your allies are. I mean, there are, for example, in Andhra Pradesh, where the largest transition of conventional agriculture to agroecological agriculture is happening. That's a state-led process. And in many respects, it's kind of awesome. It's doing the sorts of things that we would like the state to do, I think, which is to invest heavily in agroecological science and then invest heavily in helping people transition from industrial to agroecological farming and provide the infrastructure for that to take place. And at the same time, the state is not challenging things like the power relations that underlie land, or it's not really taking the side of laborers, particularly landless laborers, and it's not challenging the caste system. There was a fantastic paper that I was reading recently in which one of the activists who was doing agroecological farming has this particular kind of biostimulant that he makes, but he doesn't make it himself, but he gets laborers to do it for him because it involves fish products, and his caste doesn't allow him to touch animals. This marvelously weird, wild, contradictory moment where the state is teaching him how to do this, but his caste prevents him from actually doing it. So he has laborers come in, and it's beautifully agroecological and shot through with caste prejudice, and still the state is doing it. So what do we feel about the state? I mean, there's no easy answer here.
Yeah. I mean, you spoke about people feeling uncomfortable before, and I think the role and the relationship between peasant movements and the state is always uncomfortable, right? And it should be uncomfortable. We should be able to sit in the discomfort of, we want the state to do things. We want to, be encouraging the state to do positive things or to stop doing negative things. But at the same time, we have to hold them to account and hold our own communities, closer, and sit with, the discomfort of between what the state is doing, what the movement actually needs, which are not always the same thing.
No, and I think the other thing, Raj, that you spoke to is that the discomfort, I mean, this is where the bourgeois always holds its line, right? Because they don't like being uncomfortable. And so whether it's, how do you answer that question of, in giving the state more power, how much of your own power and privilege are you prepared to give up so that others can have more as well? And that's like the fundamental question where we run into the problems of state cooptation or corporate cooptation again, because that discomfort of giving something up constantly leads to a retaking of power, right? So, there's some who want to become the rentier class, and there are others who want to overthrow them. And how do we convince the first to join the second?
No, that's right. And I think you put your finger on the process mattering a great deal, right? Where I mean, how do we learn who our friends are and who our enemies are? It's only through struggle, and it's only through fighting and confronting power. And that process is at its heart a sort of anti-state engagement. I mean, it's also anti-corporate, but we learn through struggle. Freedom is this constant struggle, and struggle is a school. So if we're interested in a movement that's building its power, then you need people to go to movement school. And what's the best movement school? It's fighting the state and fighting, its organs and its instruments and the corporations that have bought it and which it favors. So, absolutely, fighting the state is a great way of building a movement. But if we're fighting the state all the time, what are we getting from the state? And the minute we get something from the state, are we rendered quiet? And we get to take the weekend off. And unfortunately, there are no weekends off in the struggle.
No, absolutely.
So, Raj, I know that you've been working on the idea of creating counter-hegemony. So I wondered if you could sort of tell us what you mean by that in this context, and what does it look like in a practical sense? What kind of examples can you give us?
Well, so the idea of hegemony is just a way of pointing out that the ruling class doesn't rule just by itself. There are more and less powerful members of the ruling class. And there was a time where it was industrialists. And these days it's the AI folk and the banks that bankroll them. So there's always division in the higher sort of echelons of the bourgeoisie, and they always get to bring along members of the working class. And this is sort of where populism festers, or the worst kind of populism, where the right wing working class movements see themselves in an alliance that's made through race, that allows conversations to divide certainly society into ways that obfuscate class relationships, and instead it's just a racial issue. So hegemony works by through coercion and consent, and that's how the states, how states work, and how empires rise and fall. But when empires fall, and we're in the middle of the decline of the U.S. empire, the rest of the world, and within the U.S. empire, we have a moment of interregnum, of sort of chaos, where anything is possible. And in this moment, it's possible for us as working class and as middle class members of a sort of certain fraction of the middle class to find and build new alliances. And so counter hegemony is about, again, finding the folk on your side, whether it's in the fields or in the warehouses or in the kitchens, and or even in the classrooms, and figuring out how we get to work together and recognize that it's only by working together we can push back against the hegemony of the ruling class as it declines and as it panics and as it goes through these sort of paroxysms of even worse repression.
And in your most recent paper on building counter hegemony, I think you make some really important points about the many stages and the kind of the building forward and the falling back as you try to build counter hegemony, and that counter hegemony also, to my understanding, is not meant to be about building a new power block that takes over from the old power block in its unity of consent. It's actually, we're trying to build a very diversified counter hegemony. It's almost like, I don't know if it's the right language, but like counter hegemonies. It's like all these different ways of contesting power and not letting it rest back in one vested place, whether that's corporations or the state. It's about dispersed power amongst the people. And so your examples in there were so interesting, I think, for us to read and think about how the Black Panthers built power, how they actually, I really like the internal to the movement, to fight patriarchy. If they're saying they're fighting patriarchy, well, then the men need to feed the school meals to the children as well, because this is about internalized patriarchy as well as what we fight against in the structures of power. And yeah, the whole paper was, I've read it twice because because I'm waiting for the second one, Raj. I know there's a part 2. Don't make me read it a third time while I wait for the second one to write.
No, but thank you. No, I mean, I for folk who, in order to not have everyone suffer to read this paper, I mean, the idea is that what's going on is not just, hey, why don't we all get together and join hands and smash the system? Because people have been trying that forever. But there are certain moments in the history of the world. There are certain moments on the clock of the world where it's possible to change the world. And I've been teaching for 20 odd years, and all my students wanted to change the world, but the time was never right, and now it is. And I think that's one of the ideas in the paper, is that when we see the decline of a hegemon like the United States, all of a sudden cracks begin to appear in the relationships that it has sponsored around the world. And there are possibilities not just within the United States, but everywhere, to be able to re-articulate and push back against things. So the stories I tell in the paper are about, for example, the Italian, the Mondine, the rice weeders, who had a vision of what it meant to be Italian that was very different from the sort of fascist vision. And they had experiences of solidarity where they would put their bodies in front of the trains to be able to allow workers in the city to be able to win rights. And there was everyone fighting for each other, as you say, in a very distributed way, but in a way where every intervention was an experiment. And I think that's the other thing that we ought to talk about here, is that actually no one knows exactly what's going to work, because every moment of social history is in some ways radically new. And yet we have learned from our struggles in the past, so that every time movements are experimenting, they're engaging in science. And we've always had this idea taken away from us that movements are reactive, or they're just, sort of spontaneous. But every movement that I know is very strategic in what it tries and and then how it learns from its mistakes and how it watches the other side play chess, and then you play again. And I think what we need is to respect our own intelligence as we form this counter hegemony, and realize that if we have the right media, if we have the right ways of interpreting what's going on, if we have the right kinds of connections, if we walk together and in solidarity with our comrades in other places, we will have a much better chance for these experiments to be successful.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and actually, your point about spontaneity, because I've been reading Rosa Luxemburg again recently, and those points about the role of spontaneity in our movements. What we've said in winning the micro-abattoir reforms that we won here in Victoria in August, we keep describing it as a combination of strategy and serendipity, right? So they brought us the right crises arrived after enough strategy, so that, I mean, that's the combo, right? Problem is, you don't always want to wait for a bloody crisis to win, but it seems to be really critical to the combination that gets us over the line. And so the other part I think about that is your point about alliances and fighting for and with each other. We took the Nyaleni call for intersectionality very seriously, and AFSA was one of the few organizations that brought labor organizers, trade unions with us, as well as, so I know not enough others did that, I think, because I think even in that decision-making space, there was like an assumption that there was some kind of higher power within the different organizations that was going to organize it. But we took it as, we are Nyaleni, so we will bring labor organizers from Australia, and we expected other people would do the same. And not very many countries did that. So now that we're back home, we're taking it further, and we're still collaborating. They came to our food sovereignty convergence for the first time. And then the president of the trades hall in Bendigo said to me, "We'll get you up when we've got the health unions and the food manufacturing unions all there for one of the big meetings, and we'll suspend orders, and we'll just let you say a thing about food sovereignty and why we should all get involved with food sovereignty." And so this is going to be complicated work. And to your point about Heal Food Alliance and all the relationship building, that they've done in the US, I think that's where the beginning of that now here, to build those alliances across sectors in a way that we haven't meaningfully done previously, aside from with First Peoples and farmers. We haven't gone outside of that, and urban activists. We haven't moved outside of the middle classes very much, to be honest. And so now spreading to work with trade unions. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg also has views on the trade unions, but I think that they're important defenders of workers' rights, and so does she. So we'll see how this goes as alliances, and there are many more to come.
By the way, I know that there won't be video going out with this podcast, so folks should know that I was doing a very happy dance when Tammi was talking about the labor unions at the Nyaleni Forum. This was something that So for people who don't know, Nyaleni is the Via Campesina sort of once every 10-year mega meeting. And, you know, every time it has a theme. So the first theme was about food sovereignty, and then 10 years later it was about agroecology. And this time it was about convergence. And I was missing a little bit of that convergence vibe. And so I'm excited that actually that Labour was there in some way. And I think that's something we absolutely need more of. When we're thinking about these alliances, you know, here in the United States, we have something called Make America Healthy Again, which is a right-wing hijacking of everything that we have been fighting for, which is, you know, we're thinking about public health for the working class. You know, who is it that is absolutely at the sort of spear tip of the diseases that the food industry inflicts on people. It's the working class here. And in America, for every dollar we spend on food, we spend $1 on treating diet-related disease. It's a one-to-one relationship. And our food economy is $1.1 trillion. So it's absolutely mad that all of a sudden that block has seen itself not in a progressive movement, but in these sort of right-wing lunatics. But I mean, there are reasons for that, and we should, that's a conversation for next time. But I love the idea that y'all will be at the trades hall and actually doing that in a way where you get to learn from the mistakes that we've made here that allowed some of that stuff to be poisoned by
exactly. And the thing actually in some of the conversations with some of the comrades from the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, so these are mostly factory workers in like McCain's and fruit canning and these sort of, well, there's not much of that left, but those are the workers. And so we've already had some interesting conversations about a lot of what they see us advocating for is the end of that kind of factory production, which is the end of their workplace. And so how are we going to reconcile this now? And they're very interested in the idea of, for example, employee-owned workplaces, obviously. Of course, we're very far from that in the current situation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be aiming for that. And then as in our conversations, we've said, well, and imagine then you make it to the point of employee-owned workplaces, which because they're employee-owned and these people's families are reliant not only on the income, but also the kind of foods that are being produced in those places, then the investment in changing what's being produced in those places changes because the employees actually have that visceral buy-in to let's produce something that's better for everybody. And they actually are doing an amazing campaign called Food Fight. And there's sort of two parts of it. One is that they are talking about food as food, not commodity. They're actually trying to sort of change a conversation about commodity foods from the factories, which is Raj is dancing again for those not watching. And the other part of it, Raj, you won't believe this. So in their enterprise bargaining agreements, they're trying to advocate for local procurement policies to require them not to bring in cheap imports for these foods and to protect the local farming community from losing the contracts. So they actually really started the solidarity work. We're a step behind, and we're reaching out and joining in together to try and see where this goes. Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
I think another interesting.
Sorry, go on. Yeah, I was going to say, Lucy, can you have the conversation? Sorry.
No, that's all right. I knew this would happen. I'm just along for the ride. I was just going to offer another interesting example where, workers are interacting with the food system in a way that I think AFSA is in an interesting position with, is workers who are working in sort of the major meat processing facilities and the big brands that are doing small goods because, of the nitrate preservatives, which have a known and direct link to bowel cancer. But the workers in those factories, in addition to their pay, one of the perks is that they all go home with lots of packets of bacon and ham packed full of preservatives. And so not only are they working in these factories, they're then, consuming a lot of the poison that's being put into this food. And so as AFSA works towards more small scale processing on farms, and as part of that as well, I think we'll see a really interesting change in terms of, people having power to choose whether or not to include those preservatives.
Yeah, and I mean, our farm's a good example of that. We use none of those in any of our small goods. There's no sulfites, there's no nitrates, there's no nitrites, because why would we poison ourselves willingly?
Yeah, and you get to have that choice because you're both in charge of the, your worker and owner and consumer all wrapped up in one, and so that's a power that you have. But I think in other places, workers don't have those rights. So employee-owned facilities are going to be really important to make those decisions. So Raj, we also wanted to talk about some examples that you've seen around the world of how people are building a movement, while under colonial capitalism, and how movement building can exist when we're still in this struggle and under this kind of dominant narrative. What kind of positive stories are you seeing from other parts of the world?
Well, I mean, I actually was going to just ask you what you thought of public food as a public good. So the idea that is being floated here in New York by democratic socialist upstart Zoran Mamdani is to have municipal grocery stores And so I'm nudging through some other comrades there the idea that it shouldn't be just 5 grocery stores, one in each of the 5 boroughs of New York City. It should be much bigger than that, because in any case, the only way that grocery stores work is at scale. But then if you're going to get to that scale, why not have the city do things like pay top dollar for local producers to provide food, and then pay unionized wages, high living wages for people to be able to work in these stores, and make these stores lovely, so that people want to come in there and feel like it's theirs. And that way we solve a lot of the way we attack the power of these corporate giants in choking off the supply chain very directly, and we turn food not into these sort of ultra processed trinkets that get dropped by the state into our laps, but instead move us towards eating with dignity. I mean, the idea of these grocery stores is not to solve for any one particular problem. Because if you wanted to solve for hunger, then you just give money to the working class. If you wanted to solve for supporting local grocery stores, then you would do something else. But you wouldn't unionize the store. You would just unionize supply chain. So this is a way of thinking about dignity as the glue that brings everyone together, and that's the success that I've seen when I've seen stories around the world where people are coming together and it working. The magic lies in not one particular policy or one particular hobby horse. Everything's like everything must be local, or everything must be organic, or whatever it is. But it is about everyone having dignity. That was the one lesson that I was at the beginning of a social movement in South Africa that's now the largest independent social movement. There's 180,000 people in a shack dwellers movement called Abahlali Basemjondolo. And when it started, the demand was food. Sorry, it was land and housing. But soon, the third thing that really mattered for everyone was dignity. Because folk understand that the housing and the land, they need to come now, soon, but the dignity must happen right now. And the being part of a movement articulated the possibility of doing agroecology and having one's own community kitchen, and having a library, and having a branch of a university, the University of Abahlali Basemjondolo. And because otherwise, how the working class going to go to university? No one can afford it. So we'll build our own universities. And that idea of dignity as the glue that brings us together is really important. And the right understand this too, unfortunately. I mean, they have their media channels, they have their idea of dignity, and it involves pissing on other people. But I think this is a weapon in our arsenal that we're not deploying perhaps as effectively as we might, is this idea of all of us having dignity and gaining our dignity through the success of achieving other people's dignity.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, obviously, that builds very much on the case that some of our listeners will know, but not everyone, the story of Belo Horizonte in Brazil, which our comrade Jahi Chappelle wrote such an excellent book about, beginning to end hunger, and the very long and multifaceted process that got them to begin to end hunger in a city that was something like 50% of people were going hungry when that project sort of started. And the popular restaurants and the markets and the public procurement was very much a part of that, and dignity was at its center. Like it's as you say, it's core to. In fact, it's why the popular restaurants, it was $1 for a meal. No matter, you didn't have to come in and say whether you needed to pay $1. Just anyone could walk in and for $1 get a meal, which kept dignity for everybody. So the thing that's interesting for us thinking about that kind of public procurement through a state market, as a smallholder myself, the lived experience I bring to public procurement is that selling food to the government absolutely sucks. Like, it's the worst. They are very difficult. So because of the bureaucracies, they're hard to actually just get through the paperwork level of selling them food. And then they're very bad payers. They'll pay you. The state government in this country, I'm not going to say it out loud because I'm working with them very closely right now, and in Victoria, it took them 6 months to pay me for a whole pig once years ago. Like, they wanted it for a big steak dinner that they did. And so that was in our early days, when that was a huge amount of money to us, because we were still quite a small, well, we're still small, but very small then. So those lived experiences of feeding state mechanisms has shown me that I think there's a terribly important part for these things to play, but this is the same as we always say in food sovereignty, you need peasants on the ground to tell you what's going to make that system work, because aggregating us into that machine is really hard. And also because, to your point about also not only having 5 markets in the 5 boroughs, the farmers actually prefer to feed people they can see. And so when you aggregate us into the machine and we lose that direct connection that we're aiming for, then you actually diminish something of what we're all advocating for. Now, some aggregation will have to happen because of the size of our cities, obviously. But you could be connected to particular markets and particular neighborhoods. And, there could be bodegas everywhere, basically, instead of big centralized markets. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of power in it. I just think you need the people who do the growing and the processing and the distributing on the ground to be the ones who design that system, because they know what they need to do to get it to market.
I love that, particularly since, let's take this Brazil example. Belo Horizonte was this jewel in the crown of anti-hunger activism. And then Bolsonaro wins, right? This is exactly gets us back to the beginning of our conversation about how do we feel about the state? Well, these restaurants were hostage to Bolsonaro and to the prevailing political winds, and it's far from certain that the PT will continue to endure. But anyway, Bolsonaro came, and all of a sudden Brazil plunged back onto the world hunger map, which is a threshold criterion about undernourishment. And so Brazil, because of these policies before Bolsonaro under Lula, Brazil had finally lifted itself off the global hunger map. Lula threw everyone back on, and then under Lula again, Lula 2, Brazil is now off the global hunger map. But there's a difference this time, where if you go to Sao Paulo, for instance, the movements have learned that you don't want the state to be doing some of this stuff. You don't want the state to be doing the catering. Because the state is vulnerable. And in fact, what we need is the state to give us money. And so what happens is the MST comrades will sell to through a new sort of purchasing law to the comrades who are in part of the MTST, which is the movement of people without a roof, the housed movement. And the MTST, who own the trucks and the supply chain, will bring that stuff into town, and then not only have these solidarity kitchens where they do the cooking and they use the cooking to recruit people to the movement, but there are also these markets where farmers can come and have direct connections with everybody, but everything in the market's free. And the way that the state gets deployed there bears the scars of the lessons of ceding too much power to the state. So I'm with you. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and so that's in our kind of reform theory of change. Reform as one of the many steps to revolution. The reforms that we advocate for and we really reaffirmed at Convergence recently is the ones that are the means to the end, right? The ones that are actually about putting power back in the hands of the people, not the frittering at the edges. We're not dithering while the planet burns. We're advocating for reforms that give power back to people, to design systems that are people-centered, planet-centered.
And I think it's interesting.
I want to hear from Luke.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that you talk about reform, because that's sort of the next question that I wanted to dig down into. So reform is, it's part of the revolutionary change, but it's not the end goal. So how do we work out which reforms, where we fight them, when we fight them, who are we fighting for when we pick those battles? I guess how do we choose where to be placing our energy?
Well, I've already sort of said what AFSA's approach is. Yeah. So, Raj, I'm really interested to hear what you're seeing in other places. And I will just say, though, because having just finished Reform or Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg's book again, which is a very short book, and I really recommend it to people. It's a very good read. In it, she talks about revolutionaries will never say there's no place for reform, and they will never say reform or revolution. It's reformists who say that it has to be one or the other. And so reform is the pathway to revolution, but you do need to pick your battles. What are you trying to reform? Is it actually strategic in the move to revolution, to overturn everything? Or are you investing a ton of energy in something that's not going to actually get us on the revolutionary path? So that's how AFSA now is sort of analyzing what things we're advocating for reform on, and not trying to put too much of our, we're all volunteers. The amount of energy we can put into a labeling change is probably not going to be very worthwhile. There are other bodies that can fight for those little things that hold a line, that protect people's interests a bit more, that attenuate capitalism, as they say, that make it a little bit more comfortable. But we're actually not seeking to make capitalism more comfortable. We're seeking to erode it until it's overturned.
Like Dr. Jonas says, I think that's absolutely right. Right? That if one's there just to make, it's important to recognize that there is a crisis in the working class, and this is what the Black Panthers realized is that we need survival. If people are not having enough to eat, then sure, let's do a reform to get people things to eat. But or people don't have shoes, or don't have healthcare, or don't have or are feeling unsafe at night. In the long term, obviously, you want people to feel safe at night, but in the short term, you help people who are feeling unsafe by walking next to them armed. And the point of that is to build these programs that are about survival pending revolution. So the Black Panthers understood that the last thing any revolutionary movement wants to do is ignore the plight of the working class because you're waiting for some moment of the rays of class consciousness will finally reach people and then they will overthrow the government. That's not how it works. In fact, you build a movement through recognizing that in fact comrades who are outside our movement are absolutely struggling and are having just an awful time, and our job is to be in solidarity and to work with them to provide not only whatever it is that is required right now, but also the consciousness and the political education that will allow us all to be able to make things much, much harder for capitalism. So, again, this is another way of saying what Tammi just said, which is it's worth being strategic, and it's worth knowing that if you're in a movement that's worth a damn, you'll probably make mistakes. And this is the other thing that I think is really important, that any movement worth its salt has gone wrong at some point. Because, again, I'm thinking of the Shack Dwellers movement in South Africa. There was a moment where the Shack Dwellers are like, fine, look, the ANC is not giving us what we want. We're going to try and endorse this other party. It didn't work out. And the decision was taken through incredible amounts of deliberation at the grassroots, and everyone was like, and there was a lot of acrimony. And in the end, the majority ruled, and we tried the experiment, and it was a disaster. And that's fine. That's this is the condition of freedom that we want. Is like if there's some sort of bearded revolutionary with food stuck in his beard telling you what to do, that's not the movement anyone wants to be a part of. It is precisely that we can democratically deliberate and make mistakes that we can actually build this movement properly.
Absolutely, great.
Yeah, I love that idea that, everyone's going to make a mistake. All of the movements will make a mistake, because I think often there's this idea that, we need to be perfect somehow, or if the movement fails in any way, it will be seen as, a way that the right can come in and say, well, see, they're not real, or they can sort of justify the non-existence, or that it's fake or something like that. But actually failure is very human, and it's an important part of growth in a movement. And, we don't need to let perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say, right? Sometimes people talk about the left eating the left, because we're not seen as perfect enough for each other. And there's that infighting around, mistakes being made or imperfections. But yeah, I think acknowledging mistakes will happen and learning from that is hugely important.
Lucy, I mean, that's why I think that this idea of movement science is important, because if we understand it as an experiment rather than as a personal, foray into something, then experiments are always experiments. There's no ego necessarily there, or there's less ego. I mean, I know scientists with plenty of ego who do conducting experiments. So I'm not saying there's zero ego, but it allows a frame to be able to come around the table. And the best kinds of discussions that we've all had in our movements is when all of a sudden we surrender our egos and we're just studying something because we want to understand, and we are asking the right kinds of questions. And all of a sudden, the sort of vulnerabilities in the ego, we feel there's a sort of moment of ego death. And that's the sort of Zen moment of movement organizing, where everyone's like, fucking hell, I didn't realize we spent 4 hours looking at this. And it happens because we've been really good scientists about studying something, and those are the moments that movement time is when I think movements are learning and engaging in the right kinds of science. And sure, you can't have science without error.
Yeah, and I think the other salient point there is that experimentation happens, democratically and non-hierarchically. Like, we're doing that together. So when our experiment fails, our experiment fails. Instead of your bearded guru who said we had to do this and was fucking wrong, and now, sure, was he really the left? Are we the left eating the left if somebody thinks that they're just going to tell us all what to do? So I think it's collective experimentation, collective failure is a lot easier to bear than having individual egos push us in a direction that turns out to be wrong. I will share a concrete example, though, of that failure. Back when I was a student activist at Melbourne Uni years and years ago, the tutors in the different faculties were being paid very different amounts for their teaching and for their marking and for their student consultation hours. And the arts faculty had something like, 6 schools or whatever. So we did this sort of comparative analysis and took it to the dean and said, history is being paid the best, and we would like everyone to have these conditions. And cultural studies is sort of in the middle, and politics is horrendous. They're not being paid for marking. They're not getting student consultation hours. They do that all in their free time. And they took our wonderful table and they chose politics, and everybody got the worst common denominator because we spelled out to them that across their faculty, there was a cheaper way to do things. And so we learned from that, never bring them a comparative analysis where they can choose the lowest common denominator, because that's what they're invested in doing.
Yeah, wow.
Oh, lesson learned.
So,
Absolutely.
Lesson learned. So what's next? What's the next reform on the path to revolution? Where do you see the opportunities coming now in this moment of crisis in our world? It's open to.
Well, I'll say something about what we're doing with AFSA, and then I'll hand it to Raj, who I'm sure will pull us out into a bigger picture as well. At the Convergence, we talked about this building the counter-hegemony here in Australia, a project, we've all been invested in for a long time, but not always particularly strategically, not always taking that more holistic view. Coming back from Yeleni with the view of the debt campaign, a debt resistance campaign. So, of course, we take inspiration from our sisters in the Vimukti Women's Collective in Sri Lanka, who have the Gavana Ne, Gavana Bay campaign, which is cannot pay, will not pay, resistance against predatory microfinancing loans. And then that has spread across through Monla, their national organization that has spread through the whole country. Now, all of Sri Lanka has women's communities leading debt resistance and not only at the personal microfinance level, but also taking on more of that question of sovereign debt because of IMF and Asia Development Bank debts. And then through Monla's membership of La Via Campesina, it's now made it to Karnataka, and there are women's groups in Karnataka who are fighting it in India as well. And so that collective, spreading is making the debt resistance campaign is kind of writing itself from region to region now as it emerges. Now, who knows what that global picture will take as we committed to a debt resistance campaign while we were in Sri Lanka. But we came home to so-called Australia and said, well, what would it look like here in one of the most neoliberal states, in the world? And so we knew, also reading Raj and thinking for years about these things, that to change a conversation about debt is a big project. And so what we agreed to at the Food Summit, because debt is not normal and debt is individualized and people feel shameful and they take their debt away on their own and they don't realize they have a collective struggle. They think they have an individual shame. And so to change that conversation is a big project. And so we decided at the Convergence that we will write our third book. Our first is Farming Democracy. Our second is Eating Democracy. And the third is going to be a debt-free democracy. The revolution will not be borrowed. If our comrades who wrote The Revolution will not be funded, don't mind us using that subtitle. So we want to write this book. The process of writing the book is a process of political formation. For those writing it, for those engaging with the project, as we promote the project around here and around the world. And then by the second year, the book is a political tool for political formation. We're using it in communities all over the place by that point, and there are different conversations happening. Hopefully somebody wants to make a short doco on the debt-free alternatives that are going to be in the book. And by the third or fourth year, there's a different national conversation happening. You've done some discursive shifts, and now you can commence the discussion about an actual debt resistance campaign. So you've looked at debt-free alternatives, but what would resistance to existing debt look like in a country like this? And so we've, for really the first time, and I've been with AFSA for 13 years, and it's the first time we've taken a kind of 5-year view towards the, millennium view of what are we fighting for and how are we going to get there and how long do we think this part's going to take us?
Wow, how exciting. I mean, here in the US, one of the things that came out of Occupy was the Debt Collective. And I'd love to put y'all in touch with them if you're not
We're
yet.
not, and they're on our list,
because,
so yes, please.
Okay, excellent. We'll do that after rounding out here. I mean, one of the other things that I think is important thinking about debt is what do you do when the debt is overwhelming, right? How do movements react to that? How do movements tend to people? And will always become more acute in times of crisis, particularly climate crisis and climate emergency. And in that moment, when movements are looking after people who have lost everything and are still in debt, there is a moment in which movement care matters a great deal. And so the sorts of things I'm seeing are particularly driven by very deep gender analysis in movements in the global south and in the global north. An understanding that the climate emergency is a crisis of care as well as a crisis of capitalism. And I've been doing some work again with Amatlali, but also with the MST in Brazil and the Southern Thai Peasant Federation in Thailand, and Lilac Indigenous Women and a group in the US as well, West Street Recovery. And we've one of the convenings we had, the thing that became very clear was that actually this care work is movement work, and it is also a mobilizing opportunity. And again, just like with the Black Panthers, right? You recognize that there is a crisis and people need to survive, and we need to survive pending revolution. And I just don't think that the Panthers had this more capacious idea of care as a way of caring not only for humans but for the rest of the web of life. In a way that gave us a language to be able to understand that care as resistance. So the project I'm working on at the moment is a project of care and resistance that is precisely about sort of brokering these conversations so that movements can see themselves in one another and see the care work, and then just sort of exchange, as a scientific congress, ways of adapting and using other lessons learned in other places, so that when these crises of care emerge, the infrastructure is there not only to meet it, but also to recruit and to build the movement.
Amazing. So we'll have to talk further about that, because it sounds like the work you're already doing on that is going to dovetail really nicely with what we're trying to do here. And even the strategies of how to use, like once we have this book of examples, both here in Australia and overseas, how that can be used as an organizing tool in communities to bring them into stronger relations of care to build before the debt resistance campaign. Because I totally agree. You have to be in some kind of relations to feel enough trust in others that you will be able to collectively resist, right? If you think you're the only one who's going to do it, you're on your own.
I'm going to send you the Care and Resistance zine for the podcast footnotes. They're not called footnotes, are they?
I don't know what they're called.
But yeah, I'll send those along for you all to have a look at, because it's a lovely zine that's exactly about this.
Fantastic.
Excellent. So look, we're nearly out of time, but I just wanted to throw it open again for any other stories of revolution that you'd like to share, or any other moments in the movement that you think we can take hold of here in so-called Australia and learn from.
Actually, Raj, maybe you could actually answer some of those Heal Food Alliance questions as an example of a convergence of movements and the ways. Give people some idea of how they've been doing that and what they're able to do now, because they are in a convergence, because that's really what we're entering into more strongly.
So for folk who haven't heard of it before, Tammy's referring to the Heal Food Alliance, which stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor, Food Alliance. And that was always the roadmap that they had, was bringing together these sort of individual issue areas as and helping the working class and NGOs in one silo to recognize that they were going to be much stronger if they operated together and across different geographies. And this process took forever, and it took the right kind of activist who spends most of their time listening. And who is, it is one of the great activist skills is to shut the fuck up. just to be able to absorb and to get the rhythm and then to show up for other people. But through this very patient, years of organizing and turning up in the worst possible moments for another movement and just being there and not just sort of standing around, but not standing in solidarity, but moving in solidarity and mobilizing resources, making sure that people got what they needed. This alliance ended up, is now one of the most robust networks of radical of radicals from the working class and from fractions of the bourgeoisie across the United States. I think if one wants to see a space that is able to hold this radicalism in a way that also holds the dignity of all of its members, then the work that Navina Khanna has done with the Heal Food Alliance is really peerless. I mean, she's an incredible activist, but her superpower is to listen and to hear people in a way that they've never been heard before. And I do think that's that's integral to every movement. And again, in South Africa, Sibu Zikode is just an incredible. I mean, he can hear people people are sort of reduced to tears by his act of listening. And when you do that, that's that is that you've got activist gold there. And I know that there is activist gold on this call. So I'm excited for that for that to happen as you build your movement here.
Thanks for that. I look forward to going and listening in that trades hall soon.
A final happy dance for me.
And please, we hope you're all doing a happy dance while you're listening to the podcast as well. We highly approve of happy dances whenever you can. It's important to find joy in the movement as well, right? Thank you for listening to this episode of the Agroecology Radio Hour. If you'd like to support AFSA's work, please head to our website, fsa.org.au, where you can become a member. As we work through the administrative follow-up to our name change, you can still find us by searching the Australian and Food Sovereignty Alliance on social media, and you can also sign up as a subscriber to this podcast on buymeacoffee.com and contact us via our email address, australian.food.sovereignty@gmail.com. Thanks to our producer, Ivan Blackett, and our guests, Dr. Tammi Jonas and Raj Patel. We'll put the relevant links in the show notes to articles and books written by Raj, more about Jonai Farms and AFSA's ongoing work, as well as links to some of those organisations that we spoke about. And of course, please share this podcast with your networks to help grow the food sovereignty movement in Australia and beyond. Viva!